Thank you for inviting me to be part of this day, and thanks to all of you who are spending your Saturday here hanging out with us. And in this last talk of this morning, in some ways it follows perfectly from the previous talks, because what I do is I work from genetics to psychology. And so I work on big gene finding projects of the type that Dr. Michaelson was talking about. And the methods he talked about for how we find genes, in his case, he was talking about language impairments, but it's the same methods that we use to find genes involved in substance problems or cardiovascular disease or diabetes or whatever you're interested in. It's basically, are people who have this condition or this trait, do they have a sequence of DNA at particular locations that's different than people who don't have this trait? That's the very basics of gene finding. So I work on gene finding in the area of substance use and psychiatric outcomes. But I'm interested not just in can we find those genes, which is an interesting question for all the kinds of reasons that Dr. Michaelson talked about, but once we find those genes, we actually want to know what they do, how do they affect behavior, and ultimately, how can we use that knowledge to make a difference? And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit at kind of a higher level of how do we go from understanding something about how genetics works to using that information to make a difference in our lives. So my talk could also be titled, with apologies to any of the science teachers out there, what you really should be learning about genetics in high school biology. So I'm going to give you a 20-minute intro to the kind of genetics that I think is really important and that not enough people understand. So you all can go out and be ambassadors for this as well. So I'm going to try not to just talk at you, but I actually want you all to tell me a little bit about what you know and what you're learning. And so we're going to try and do this in a bit more of an interactive way, too. So to start, raise your hand if you have done some of this in high school biology. Virtually all of us, right? We have all done Punnett squares, and we've talked about blue eyes and brown eyes, or you've done Punnett squares and you've talked about wrinkled peas and smooth peas and Mendel and all of that. And that's really important. That's basic genetics, right? But now I want you to raise your hand if you have talked about complex genetics. A handful of you, that's great. Or how about, how many of you all have talked about multifactorial polygenic disorders? Okay, great, a couple of you, that's fabulous. What I want is for everybody out here to understand how this works. And that's because this is the kind of genetics that affects every single one of us, that touches all of our lives. Because this is the kind of genetics that influences most outcomes. And so there are rare disorders that are influenced by single genes. And there are things like eye color, although there's even multiple genes that influence eye color too. And there's genes that code for things like having a head and having two hands. And it gives this idea when you just study Punnett squares that genes are somehow determinative. But for lots of things that are genetically influenced, genes play a role, but they don't determine an outcome. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about. And so this idea of multifactorial, there's many factors that can influence an outcome, some of which are genetic, and usually are polygenic, meaning multiple genes. Lots of genes and the environment, and it's how all these things come together. And when you're studying something like substance use, psychiatric outcomes, or cardiovascular disease or cancers, or most of those kind of things, the things that influence millions and millions of people follow this kind of complex genetic pattern. So we're going to do a little exercise here together. I want you to raise your hand if you think each of the things that I'm going to run through is genetically influenced, okay? And then we're going to go through the right answers. Okay, to start off with, I'm not sure why these came up at the same time, but height. How many folks here think height is genetically influenced? Raise your hand high if you think, okay, virtually everybody thinks height is genetically influenced. How about weight? Raise your hand if you think weight is genetically influenced. Okay, we have about half of the folks here. How about asthma? Okay, a lot of folks think asthma is genetically influenced. Depression. You have about as many folks who think depression. Cardiovascular diseases. Okay, lots of folks think that's genetically influenced. Alcohol use. About half folks may be genetically influenced. And following Dr. Bell's lecture here, personality. How many folks think personality is genetically influenced? You all were a little primed. A lot fewer people usually think personality is genetically influenced. So the answer is that all of these things show some degree of genetic influence. And what this little cheat sheet does here is it kind of groups things into how much they're influenced by genetic factors. And so things like language, now of course this is a bad example after this morning in the sense that I'm not talking about how well you can speak a language, I'm talking about what language you start speaking. I don't speak English because I was genetically predisposed to be much better at English than I am at Chinese. I speak English because my parents spoke English, right? The language that you start speaking is something that's purely environmental. How well you speak it might be genetically influenced, is genetically influenced. Similarly, what religion, the church that somebody first walks you into, is a function of the adult that first takes you into this. Now, how much you like church and how often you go, that might be genetically influenced. Things that are in the range of 20 to 30% genetically influenced are things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders. The kinds of things that I study, alcohol and drug dependence, addiction, antisocial behavior, conduct problems in kids, they're somewhere around 50% genetically influenced. And what I have shown on the other side is other kinds of biomedical conditions and outcomes that are of about similar degrees of genetic influence. Highly genetically influenced are things like more severe mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, autism. And on the other hand, over here, things like height, weight show significant genetic influence. I'm going to pause here and ask you all, in looking over this, is there anything up there that surprises you or that you might not have thought falls into the categories that it's in? So that is the #1 comment I get, I would have thought depression was more heritable. Would anybody have guessed, if you didn't have the answer up here, that alcohol use would be less heritable and depression would be more heritable? Did anybody kind of think that might? I see lots of nodding heads. That's a #1 thing I get from my students. I have a hypothesis as to why that is, why there is this misconception. I think, and I have no scientific evidence of this, this is just my hypothesis, that where this comes from is the fact that what we have for depression that we don't have for alcohol problems is effective drugs to treat them. So I'm guessing everyone out here has seen the commercials that say, depression is caused by a biochemical imbalance in the brain, right? And it's got the little neurotransmitters moving. And who pays for all those commercials? The drug companies that want you to go into your doctor and ask for the drugs. What we don't have are effective drugs to treat addiction. And so what that marketing does is gives the idea that this is a biological disorder, which depression has a biological component, but even less so than some of these other things like alcohol use, which still is viewed more as a choice. My guess is that as we better understand the underlying biology of addiction, and we have more effective drugs potentially to intervene there, then what you will see is a shift in marketing, and my guess is a shift in attitudes surrounding that. But this really, I think, reinforces the idea of how our conceptions about to what extent biology plays a role and to what extent environment plays a role in all these things that are both genetically and environmentally influenced is so impacted by cultural factors and by stigma and other kinds of things as well. So when I say something is heritable, and that's what these numbers over here are essentially how heritable, how genetically influenced it is. Something really important to know is that what that does not mean when I say alcohol problems are 50% heritable, it does not mean that 50% of the reason why I am an alcoholic, I'm not, let's not start any rumors, but if I was, 50% of the reason that I'm an alcoholic is because of my genes, and 50% is because of my environments. What that means is that 50% of what causes the differences between all of us, so how much Dr. Bell drinks and Dr. Michaelson drinks and I drink and each one of you out there, if you're over 21, drinks, is due to differences in our genetic makeup. So it doesn't apply to, heritability doesn't apply to an individual, it applies to a population. Now, here's why this is important and why you should care about this. If you think about a rectangle, what contributes to the area of a rectangle? The length and the width, exactly. Okay, so if we have now a population of rectangles, and I want to know, and I'm asking you all, why are these rectangles different? Why are their areas different? Why is the area of all those rectangles different? The length, right? They differ in how tall they are. That's what makes those rectangles different. Now we have another population of rectangles, and these rectangles differ in their area, but what makes these rectangles different from each other? Their width, right? This is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about how heritable an outcome is. What makes people different on a particular outcome is our genes and our environments. Now, it doesn't make any sense to say, is the area of a rectangle due to the length or the width? It's always both, right? It has to be both. An outcome is always both. It has to be both. Genes have to be expressed in an environment, right? The environment can only operate on a set of organisms who are made up by genes that give orders and things of that sort. So it doesn't make sense to say, is an outcome, is it nature versus nurture? It always has to be both. But if you want to know what contributes to differences, now you can ask, are differences in our genome or differences in our environment more important? And that's what heritability is all about. Another important thing to know is that there is no gene for these complex outcomes. All of the things that I put up there that we're talking about, these complex kind of outcomes, there is no single gene that influences them. There's lots of genes, probably thousands of genes. Each one just alters risk a teeny bit. And how at risk you are for something, and we're all at risk for something. We're just all at risk for different things. How at risk you are is a function of all those versions across those 1,000+, what versions you carry across those 1,000+ genes that are involved in an outcome. So I'm going to back up here for a second and say I put up all these heritability estimates, and I told you that these things were genetically influenced. And other than the fact that I happen to be standing up here and have a title and be a professor at a university, what you should be thinking is, well, how do you know that, right? Other than I'm telling you, how do we know that something is genetically influenced? How do you know that alcohol problems are genetically influenced and aren't just a function of being in a bad environment? Well, one thing that we do when we want to know something genetically influenced is we can see whether it runs in a family. And Dr. Michaelson showed a beautiful pedigree of a language impairment that ran in a family, right? So that's one first step. But what is the problem? Can we determine that from a family study that something is genetically influenced? Is that the end of the story? Can we determine this runs in a family, it's due to genes? I see a hand up in the back. Is that someone brave enough to wager a guess? It immediately went down, or stretching at the wrong time. So, anybody want to wager a guess? Yes. The question is, can you use a family study to determine that something is genetic?
A single family study.
A single family study?
I feel like no, because they have a lot of similar influences, maybe.
Yes.
In that household, for example.
That's exactly right. Biological relatives share genes, but they also share environments, right? And so if you have, we know that children of alcoholics are more likely to have alcohol problems themselves. Maybe that's because they got genes, they inherited a predisposition to develop problems, but maybe it's because being raised by parents with alcohol problems is a really crummy environment sometimes. And it puts you in environments that make you at risk and expose you to stressors, and maybe that's what causes you to drink, and maybe it's all environmental and it's not genetic. And that's why family studies can be the first step, but they can't be the final step. So a methodology that we can use to start to tease apart the extent to which genetic influences are important and environmental influences is twin studies. And so I do a lot of twin studies. And the reason that we study twins are because twins come in a couple different flavors. Monozygotic, or identical twins, which come from a single egg fertilized by a single sperm, so genetically identical individuals, because at some point during cell division, for reasons that are still not fully understood, they split into two. DZ twins, or fraternal twins, on the other hand, are two eggs fertilized by two sperm, just like ordinary siblings, except that it happens in utero at the same, they're sharing an intrauterine environment. So MZ twins share all of their genetic variation. Do any of you all remember when Dolly the sheep was cloned? I see some nodding heads, and there was tremendous controversy. Next thing you know, we're going to be cloning people. Where was all this genetics going to go? Well, there are clones walking around all over the planet, and they're called identical twins. And have any of you all known identical twins? Okay, are they exactly identical people? No. Are they more similar than, say, me and Dr. Bell? Yes, they are, because they're sharing all their genetic variation. They're also, when raised together, sharing a home environment. But if something is not entirely genetically influenced, like most of our outcomes, and identical twins are not exactly identical, we know that there are other kinds of environmental factors that must contribute to outcomes too. Dizygotic twins, so by comparing how similar MZ twins are to DZ twins, we can get an idea of how important genetic and environmental effects are. So if both types of twins are raised in their home environments, they're both sharing the same sets of parents, right? You have two siblings sharing parents, but what MZ twins share above and beyond DZ twins are more of their genes, more of their genetic variation. And so if something is genetically influenced, MZs should be more similar than DZ twins. So if alcohol use is genetically influenced, you should see that MZ twins will be more similar in their development of problems than DZ twins, because they are sharing more genes, more of their genetic variation. If, however, being raised by parents who have alcohol problems is what causes alcohol problems in kids, then how similar should DZ twins and MZ twins be? The same, right? Because they're both being raised, whether it doesn't matter how genetically related you are to your sibling, you're sharing the same home environment, and if that home environment is what causes the outcome, then it shouldn't matter if you're an MZ twin or a DZ twin. So that's the rationale as to how we can figure out how important genetic and environmental influences are, is by comparing how similar are people who share all their genes with people who share just half of their genetic variation, but while we're keeping their home environments constant. So here are some data that come from a review paper looking at a whole bunch of different outcomes. And what these show, the bars are showing how similar pairs of twins, and in this case they've collected hundreds or thousands of pairs of twins, so it's big groups. How similar are MZ twins, individuals who share all their genetic makeup, in blue, and DZ twins, individuals who share just half of their genetic makeup, in yellow. And what is the pattern that you see? So this is showing across a whole bunch of different behavioral outcomes: reading disorder, autism, Tourette's, ADHD, bulimia, panic, alcohol problems, depression, schizophrenia. What is the pattern that you see across the board? Blue bars are longer. MZ twins are more similar for virtually everything that's been studied than DZ twins. In other words, genetic factors play a really important role in virtually all of these behavioral outcomes. Now, I study alcohol use. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about alcohol use now, because it provides a wonderful model system to study complex genetics. And so by that, what I mean is all of these twin data that I've shown you have been heritability estimates that say something like alcohol is about 50% genetically influenced. But what that fails to do is to capture how dynamic genetic effects are across time and as a function of the environment. And so here's what I mean by that. One of the reasons that I think alcohol outcomes are fascinating to study is because nobody wakes up one morning and says, oh my God, I've had an onset of alcohol dependence. It just doesn't happen. Alcohol problems are an endpoint here that are associated with a whole trajectory of behavior. So the first thing you have to do is try alcohol. And then you have to go from trying it once or twice to establishing a regular pattern of use. And then for some individuals, they then move into problematic use and dependence. And so what we can do is we can ask, how important are our predispositions, or is the environment at different parts of this process? So one of the studies I work on are big twin studies over in Finland. And the reason that we go to Finland is not because there is anything special about drinking in Finns, but because Finland has a central population register. And it's a law that you have to keep your address updated with the government. So we know everybody who was born in the country in a certain period of time, and we know where to find them. And in the United States, this sounds horribly Big Brother, but in a social democracy like Finland, they participate in research at extremely high levels. So in this study, we were looking at all the twins born in the country in a 5-year period, so it's about 5,000 individuals that we can follow across time, and when we just send them a questionnaire, more than 90% of them send that questionnaire back. I wonder, I can't get 90% of my students to do anything. They don't do it for a reward, they don't do it for a payment, they send it back because in the social democracy that exists in Finland, they know if I contribute to biomedical research, it comes back and it benefits me because they also have a very good government healthcare system. So what this means is that we can follow thousands of twins across time. And one of the things that we did is we looked at kids at age 14, 16, 17, 18, and into the 20s. So this is the phase that many of you all are in, moving from adolescence into young adulthood. And we know that this is also the time when most people start to experiment with alcohol use. And so if we look at who was drinking at age 14, and we compare how similar MZ twins are to DZ twins to get an estimate of how important the environment is or our predispositions, what you will see is, now if there was a blue bar here, that would indicate how important genetic influences are. The yellow bars indicate how important shared environmental influences are. So having the same parents, being in the same school or the same neighborhood. Red bars indicate unique environmental influences. These are the things that make people different, that can make siblings different from one another, i.e., one individual has a group of friends that the other one doesn't have, or one individual gets in a car accident, or has an intrauterine, even during pregnancy gets less oxygen. So it can be any kind of environment that can serve to make people different. So what influences whether or not folks are drinking at age 14? Is it genetically influenced or is it environmentally influenced? It is almost all environmental. Because when you're 14, what do you need to be able to drink? Access to alcohol, right? And that usually, and there's all kinds of environmental things that can influence access to alcohol. Whether or not you can get it at home, whether or not people have it in your school, in your neighborhoods, etc. But here's what I think is most fascinating. We follow those kids, 16, 17, 18, and every year we're asking them, how much do you drink? What happens across adolescence is, as folks move from, I'm going to try it, to I'm going to start doing it more regularly, genes now become increasingly important. So it goes from being almost all environmental as to whether or not you first try it, to genes increasingly playing a role to the point where they account for more than 50% of the variance, which is what you find in adult populations as well. And on the other hand, environmental influences, there's always kind of these random environmental things that impact us, right? They stay, the red bars, they stay pretty constant. But these shared influences in our homes, in our families, in our schools, they start to drop off dramatically across adolescence. So whether or not you try something might be a function of your environment. But what happens as you keep using a substance? Your predisposition, how likely you are to develop problems, now that becomes really important in how much you drink and whether you develop problems. But it's not just changes across time. Your environment can also change the likelihood that you are going to express a genetic predisposition. And here's what I mean, and oh, sorry, before I get to that, this is just showing that's not just alcohol. This is for smoking too. And this is a study from Virginia twins where we're asking them to report from age 13 all the way to 40. It shows the data in a slightly different way. But red here is how important genetic influences are. And this yellowish green is how important this home shared environmental influences are. And the exact same pattern. Across adolescence, it starts off being largely environmental things as to whether or not you try smoking. Once you start smoking, genetic influences, how your body reacts to that, is going to play a huge difference in the likelihood that you become addicted. Now, this is important to all of you who are in this developmental life phase, because the fact that everybody might start trying it, your own predisposition, not everybody's going to end up at the same place. You don't know what your predisposition necessarily is going into it, but we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But be aware that what looks like normative adolescent experimentation, trying things, can be very different for people depending on what their predisposition is. You can end in a very different place. Not only that, but the environment can change whether or not you get to express your genetic predispositions. So here's something maybe some of you all can relate to. Parents. Parents and adolescents. So this was looking at what influences how much kids are smoking at age 14. Now, before I was showing a bar or an estimate of how important genetic influences are, what this is saying is, what if we allow how important, we can test how important genetic influences are as a function of the environment. So what that means is we asked kids, how much do your parents monitor you? How much do they ask you who you're with, where you're going, what you're doing? And we characterized all these families as to whether they had low parental monitoring, parents weren't always on them, or high parental monitoring. Parents had to know where you were all the time. And then what we looked at is what influences smoking across all these different types of environments. And what you see is under very low parental monitoring, the most important thing in influencing how much kids are smoking is genes, this blue line here, more than 60% heritability. What influences how much I'm smoking versus another person is differences in our predispositions. On the other hand, under conditions of really high parental monitoring, how important predispositions are becomes really non-significant. What's most important in impacting how much people are smoking is the environment. So if your parents are on you all the time, it makes it really hard to express your predispositions, which sometimes might be frustrating, but for things like substance use, can actually be very protective. So these are ways that the environment can change the likelihood that you can express a predisposition. We know that this isn't just in adolescence. So there's things like going away to college. Colleges can be, all of a sudden you have all kinds of restrictions removed. It allows more opportunity to express predispositions, which for some people can get them into trouble. So one of the things that I want to emphasize, though, is that there is no one predisposition to developing alcohol problems. Just like there's no one gene, there's no one pathway. So people can develop alcohol problems through a variety of different pathways. One of the most prevalent ones is that people who are more likely to develop alcohol problems are also more likely to be highly impulsive and sensation-seeking. And this gets at what Dr. Bell was talking about, because our predispositions influence us. Not just, we don't just have a predisposition to become addicted to a substance, but we have predispositions that influence our personality. And our personality influences, do you want to be hanging out in bars? And do you want to be around other people who are like, hey, I've got a crazy idea, let's go try it. So those are ways that our predispositions can manifest, and our genes can influence our behavior that can then influence our lives in all kinds of ways. Another way that we know that people can sometimes end up with alcohol problems is toward this predisposition to have trouble dealing with stressors, to have trouble dealing with depression or anxiety, and they're using alcohol as a way to kind of self-medicate. That's a very different predisposition than the person who's out there heavily drinking in bars. In addition, we know that there's differences in the way our bodies react to alcohol. So we talk about low and high responders. There are people who, from the first time that they ever drink, it takes them a lot more to experience what can be the pleasurable effects of alcohol. The sort of anxiolytic, it makes you feel relaxed, makes you feel laid back. Some people get that, most people, after a drink or so. Some people, it takes them several drinks to feel those pleasurable effects. If you are a low responder and it takes you more alcohol to get the same effect, then what happens? You start drinking more. You start hanging out with other people who drink more. And that can put you on a pathway to developing problems. So all of these are all different ways. This is why there's no gene for alcohol problems. All of these are different ways that genetics influence complex behaviors, physiological responses to drugs, to personality, to other kinds of outcomes like depression, that all can impact whether or not somebody has alcohol problems. And these things don't just show up at some point. They show up, they're prevalent from early in life. And this gets at, this is why this follows perfectly from what Dr. Bell was talking about. Personalities show up across species and very early. And in one particular study, we were following more than 10,000 kids since the time they were born, and they're now in their 20s. And so we were actually initially started studying pregnant mothers. And this is a project started by folks other than ourselves over in England. But what we did is we went back and looked. We looked at the mothers' reports of their babies from the time they were born through age 5. So really little kids. And we asked them, what are your kids like? What are they like? Personality from prior to age 5 is predictive of who's using alcohol in adolescence. And guess what? It was very different types of kids that were at risk for alcohol problems. One of them were the little itty-bitty kids who are super sociable, right? Those are the kids who are out hanging out in the bars then when they're 20. The other type was kids who were having problems. Kids who were having problems interacting with others and coping with stressors from the time they were very little. And the reason I mention all of this is because we might talk a lot about genetic influences on different types of disorders, but genes influence all kinds of things. So that same twin methodology that's been used to study autism and alcohol problems and cardiovascular outcomes, it's been used to study things like divorce and how religious you are, how often you go to church, voting behaviors. That's an interesting one in this particular political climate right now. Happiness. All of these things are genetically influenced because genes don't just impact a disorder, they impact our behavior, which can influence all kinds of aspects of our lives. One of the things I do is I run a big project with all the incoming students at VCU, where I'm a professor. And so we have almost 10,000 students now who fill out surveys across their college years and who give a DNA sample, saliva, hence the spit in Spit for Science. And the whole idea is from the second they step on campus to introduce them to the idea of how our outcomes, and in particular, we're interested in things like substance use and behavioral health outcomes because we know those are the biggest risk factors in emerging adults. But how all of most all of our health outcomes are a function of our predispositions and our environments and how they come together. And what we're trying to do is have all of our students be a part of generating that knowledge to understand if you are at risk, what does that look like? And what kinds of environments help reduce risk? And ultimately, then, we want to feed that research back to you all, to students and to folks who participate in it, so that it can make a difference in this case, our students' lives and their ability to succeed in college and to have healthy, happy lives. Along those lines, from that big effort, we have launched an institute called COBE, short for College Behavior, College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute. And I'm going to end with this because if anyone has a smartphone on them, this is the first time a teacher is probably going to tell you, take it out. Feel free to take it out. And look us up. You can go to our website at kobe.vcu.edu, or we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. It's VCU COBE. And what we do there is I've hired students who come out of our School of the Arts and our Journalism and Mass Communication School, and they work with the scientists to how do we take research findings and how do we make them more engaging than just our boring research papers, which other scientists love to read, but you all might not be as interested in, and how do we take research related to behavioral and emotional health, about genetics, about the environment, how do we push that back out to folks? So there's a Why Science podcast that we do with researchers. We have our art students develop blogs and design different types of things. So please feel free to follow us and contribute to that conversation. Because really what we think is that it's going to take all of us spreading the message, not just the three of us who are up here, about how health is a product of our genes, our environments, the complexity of understanding the biology of it, all the way to understanding the behavior, and ultimately how you use that knowledge to make a difference in our lives and in our world. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer a question if there is any.